They said she was too big to be wanted, too plain to be chosen, and too soft to survive the frontier. They were wrong about all of it. This is the story of Tessa Holloway, the woman an entire valley laughed at, the woman a feared cowboy chose above all others, and the woman who quietly became the reason every single one of those laughing faces still had food on their tables. If you've ever been counted out before you even had a chance to begin, stay with this story until the very end. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see just how far this story travels. Black Ridge Valley had a particular kind of cruelty that dressed itself up as honesty. People there didn't think of themselves as mean, they thought of themselves as practical. Frontier life had scraped away anything soft, anything polite, anything that wasn't directly useful for getting through the next season. And so when they looked at a person and judged them, they told themselves it wasn't judgment, it was just seeing clearly, seeing things as they were. That was what they told themselves when they looked at Tessa Holloway. She had come to Black Ridge Valley 4 years ago with her father Emmett when she was 19. They had arrived in a wagon with a cracked axle, a lame horse, and 2 trunks of goods that weren't worth much to begin with. Emmett Holloway had been a trader once, back east, and he had carried that trader's optimism with him into country that had no patience for it. He believed every piece of dry land had water underneath it if you dug deep enough, believed every difficult season was just the hard edge before the easy one. He was wrong about most of it, but he was a kind man, and Tessa had loved him for that. He was gone now. 3 years back, a fever had taken him in the span of 8 days, and Tessa had buried him on the slope behind the small house they'd built on the eastern edge of town. She'd been alone since then. Not friendless exactly. There were women who would speak to her, families who were decent enough, but alone in the way that mattered, alone in the way where no one was going to look out for her if things went wrong. She was 23 now. She had her father's stubborn streak and her mother's dark eyes, and she had a body that the valley's women discussed in low, pointed voices whenever she walked by. Tessa was big, not simply tall, not simply broad. She was heavy in a way that the frontier preferred to pretend didn't exist, because frontier life was supposed to carve people down to the essentials, and Tessa's body refused to follow that script. She ate carefully, worked hard, slept little. Her size was simply what it was. But in Black Ridge Valley, what something was and what people said it was were rarely the same thing. There goes the Holloway woman, she had heard Dorothy Crane say once, not even bothering to lower her voice. Dorothy was the wife of the general store owner, a thin-lipped woman who wore her respectability like a piece of armor. I don't understand how she manages, in this heat. The woman beside her, Tessa hadn't caught who, had laughed. A small, mean sound. Tessa had kept walking. She was good at that. The summer that everything changed began with no rain. That wasn't unusual for Black Ridge Valley. The valley sat in a fold between 2 dry ridges, and water had always been the thing the land gave grudgingly. Settlers had learned to store it, manage it, fight over it. But this summer was different. By the end of June, the creek that fed the eastern pastures had dropped to a thin trickle. By mid-July, it had stopped altogether. The sky stayed a hard, blank blue from dawn to dark, day after day, while the soil cracked open in long fissures and the grass went yellow and then brown and then simply disappeared. Livestock died first. The weaker ones, the older ones. Then the crops. Then people started getting that look in their eyes, the one that came when they'd stopped being afraid and started doing the math. Black Ridge Valley had maybe 2 months of serious supplies left. 3, if people were careful. After that, the nearest settlement with enough to trade was 4 days' ride west, through country that was rough even in good conditions. The valley's handful of wealthy ranchers were all right. They had wells, reserves, land enough to weather it. But the smaller homesteaders, the families who had come out here with very little and built their lives on very thin margins, were watching their futures dry up along with the creek. It was Harlan Briggs who proposed the bride gathering. Harlan was not a bad man exactly, but he was a man who trusted simple solutions, and this was the simplest solution he could think of. Cade Mercer, the most prosperous rancher in the region, had a well that was still running and a water reserve that could carry the valley through the drought if he chose to share it. He had pasture land, livestock, and trade connections west that no one else could match. He was, by any practical measure, the difference between the valley surviving the season and not surviving it. Cade Mercer was also unmarried, 31 years old, and had turned away every woman who'd approached his property in the last 5 years. "We bring him a bride," Harlan told the gathered men at the saloon, like it was the most sensible thing in the world. His choice. Whatever woman he picks, her family gets access to the East Well. And in exchange, Mercer agrees to open his supply lines to the valley through the dry season. There was silence. "You're talking about auctioning off women," said Pete Alderman, who ran the smithy. "I'm talking about a gathering," Harlan said. "Voluntary. Any woman who wants to participate can. Any woman who doesn't want to, doesn't." He spread his hands. "It ain't complicated." Whether it was complicated or not, the valley didn't have many other options. The notice went up the following week, tacked to the post outside the general store. Women between the ages of 18 and 35 were invited to present themselves at the Mercer Ranch on the last Saturday of July. Participation was voluntary. The gathering would last 3 days. Within a day of the notice appearing, Black Ridge Valley had its first real piece of excitement in years. Tessa read the notice twice. Then she went home and thought about it for 2 days before she did anything else. She understood what the gathering was, underneath the polite language. She wasn't naive, but she also understood the drought in a way that was personal rather than abstract, because her own water barrel was down to less than a quarter full, and she had no well of her own, and the creek that had been her backup was dry. Her vegetable garden was dead. She had enough food stored to last through October, maybe. After that, she wasn't sure. She thought about her father. She thought about what he would have said. "You can sit here worrying about your dignity, or you can do something. Can't do both at the same time, Tess." She hadn't told anyone she was going to participate. She'd simply packed a small bag on the Friday before the gathering and walked the 3 miles out to the Mercer property as the sun was going down, because she preferred to arrive when there weren't as many people to watch her do it. She wasn't the only one who'd had that idea, it turned out. The Mercer Ranch sat at the western end of the valley where the land flattened out before rising again into the ridge. It was larger than most people described it. A proper compound, almost, with a main house, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings, and a barn that was bigger than some of the homes in town. The well was visible from the gate, a stone circle with a real wooden cover, and the pasture behind the house still had green in it. Tessa stood at the gate for a moment and just looked. "You here for the gathering?" A ranch hand, young, maybe 16, was watching her from the fence post. "I am," she said. He pointed her toward the bunkhouse, where the participating women were being housed. "Go around the east side. Mrs. Alderman's setting people up in there." Mrs. Alderman was Pete's wife, a brisk, no-nonsense woman who had apparently been drafted to manage the domestic arrangements. She looked at Tessa when she came through the door, and something moved across her face. Not quite surprise, not quite pity, something in between, but she kept it professional. "Holloway," she said, checking a list. "Tessa Holloway." "Yes, you're in the back room. 3 to a room. You'll be with Clara Finch and Nora Bowen." Clara Finch was 17, pretty in the way of new things, with fair hair and a nervous smile. She looked at Tessa with wide eyes and said nothing. Nora Bowen was maybe 25, dark-haired, sharp-faced, and she looked at Tessa with something entirely different, a cool, assessing look that wasn't exactly hostile but wasn't welcoming either. "You sure you want to be here?" Nora said. Not cruel exactly, just direct. "I paid the same nothing to register as everyone else," Tessa said. "So yes." Nora considered that. Then she nodded once, as if Tessa had passed some small test, and went back to unpacking her bag. Clara Finch stared at the wall. By Saturday morning, there were 14 women at the Mercer Ranch. Tessa looked at them over breakfast in the main yard and understood, plainly and without illusion, exactly how she fit among them. Most of them were younger than she was. Several were genuinely beautiful, the kind of beauty that didn't require good light or particular angles, just existed regardless of conditions. There was Margaret Hawes, the daughter of a cattleman from the next valley over, who had ridden in on a horse that was probably worth more than most of the homesteads in Black Ridge. She wore a yellow dress that had no business being this far west, and she knew it, and she wore the knowledge like an accessory. There was Sarah Toll, who was 20 and delicate-featured, and carried herself with the particular self-possession of someone who had never once been made to feel unwelcome anywhere. Tessa sat on a fence rail near the barn with a tin cup of coffee and watched the women arrange themselves in the main yard and understood that whatever this gathering was supposed to be, it was also undeniably a performance. They were all performing, even the ones who were trying not to. She drank her coffee. "That's her," she heard, from somewhere to her left. She didn't turn. She'd gotten very good at not turning. "What is she even doing here?" A voice she didn't recognize. Young. A pause. Then lower. "I heard she has no one. No family, no property worth anything. She must just be, I don't know, hoping." "Well," a small laugh, "she'll be disappointed." Tessa set her coffee cup down on the fence rail and watched a pair of barn swallows arguing over something near the eave of the outbuilding. They were fast, sharp-winged, completely indifferent to everything happening below them. She thought, let them talk. Cade Mercer came out of the main house at 9 in the morning, and the yard went quiet in a way that told Tessa everything she needed to know about how this man was perceived. He was tall, not unusually so, but the kind of tall that felt deliberate, like the body had decided early what it was going to be and committed to it. Lean, sun-darkened, with the hands and posture of someone who worked rather than managed. He was not handsome in the way of a painting or a dime novel. His face was too angular, too weathered for that, with a crooked line to his nose that suggested it had been broken and not set right, and eyes that were an indeterminate gray-brown that settled on things and stayed there. He moved like a man who had gotten comfortable with silence. He was wearing work clothes, not dressed up for the occasion, not dressed down for it either, just dressed. There was a ranch hand at his shoulder, older, bearded, who Tessa later learned was named Walt, and another one hanging back near the barn. Cade stopped in the middle of the yard and looked at the gathered women. He didn't smile. He didn't make a speech. "I know what this is supposed to be," he said. His voice was low, not raised, but the silence of the yard was total enough that it carried without effort. "I want to be plain about something. I'm not choosing a decoration. If someone here is looking to be comfortable and left alone, this isn't the situation for it." He paused. "My ranch works. I need a partner who can work too. That's all I'm looking for." Margaret Hawes, in her yellow dress, tilted her chin up slightly. Cade looked around the yard once more. His gaze landed on Tessa, briefly, with no more or less weight than it gave anyone else. Then he went back inside. Walt, the older hand, cleared his throat. 3 days, he said to the assembled women. "Mr. Mercer will take his meals with the group, handle ranch business as usual. You're free to participate in whatever the ranch needs doing or not, as you prefer." He looked around. "Welcome to the Mercer place." The first day was what Tessa had expected, and it was worse than she'd expected, and it was also more interesting than she'd expected, which made it a complicated kind of day. Margaret Hawes clearly had a plan. By mid-morning, she had positioned herself in Cade's vicinity at every available opportunity. At the well when he came to check the water levels, near the horse paddock when he did his morning rounds, at the long table at lunch with a calculated seat that put her 2 places to his left. She was pleasant and intelligent and knew when to speak and when not to, and Tessa watched her with genuine respect for the craft of it. Sarah Toll was subtler. She was good with animals, it turned out. Actually good, not just performing goodness. She spent the morning in the paddock without trying to get anyone's attention, and Tessa watched Cade notice that. Several of the other women had gathered near the main house porch in a loose, well-dressed cluster, talking to each other more than making any effort toward Cade. And then there was the wagon. It was one of the ranch's supply wagons, an older one, and it had shed a wheel at the edge of the yard sometime in the previous week and been left there. Nobody had gotten to it. Tessa had noticed it the night she'd arrived. She'd seen the split in the wheel hub, looked at the way the axle was sitting, and calculated in her head what it would take to fix it. On the first morning, when the gathered women were doing whatever they were doing, Tessa went to the tool shed, found what she needed, and started. It was hot work. The sun was already high and the air had no mercy. She stripped down to her work shirt, rolled her sleeves, and started on the wheel. It took her an hour and a half to remove the damaged hub section, find the right piece of spare wood in the ranch's well-stocked shed, cut and shape it tolerably, and begin the reattachment. She was sweating through her shirt by the time she heard footsteps behind her. "Didn't ask you to do that," Cade said. Tessa didn't look up from the wheel. "No, you didn't." A silence. You know what you're doing? My father traded goods for 12 years. Half of that time I was repairing whatever broke on the road. She tightened the clamp. I know what I'm doing. She heard him settle against the fence behind her, not leaving. Hub's been cracked for 3 weeks, he said. My men kept saying they'd get to it. The split goes further into the grain than it looks from the outside, Tessa said. They'd have fixed the visible part and it would have broken again in 2 weeks. She tapped the new piece. This should hold properly. Another silence. She could feel him watching her work. You eat yet? He said finally. I'll eat when I'm done. She heard him walk away. Then, a few minutes later, the sound of footsteps returning, and a plate with bread and dried meat was set on the fence rail beside her without a word. She finished the repair. Then she ate. The first night after supper, the gathered women were sitting on the bunkhouse porch or in the yard, the long summer evening still too warm for comfort. The conversation moved around in the way of people who didn't know each other, probing for common ground or mutual advantage, whatever would serve. Nora Bowen sat beside Tessa on the porch steps. You fixed the wagon, Nora said. Yes. Margaret noticed. She didn't like it. Tessa looked at her hands. There was still grease under her nails. I wasn't doing it for her to notice. I know, Nora said. She picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. You know what my problem is? I know how to do things. I know how to manage a household and stretch a budget and keep animals alive through a hard winter. But I don't know how to make that visible without seeming like I'm trying to make it visible. And every time I try to make it visible, I just look like I'm trying. She paused. You don't have that problem. I have other problems, Tessa said. Yes, Nora agreed. You do. She said it without cruelty, just matter-of-factly. But not that one. They sat in the cooling evening for a while without talking. The second day brought the horses. One of Cade's working horses, a bay mare named Daggett, had come up lame during the night. The ranch's hands were occupied with other work, and when Tessa came across the mare in the paddock that morning, she stopped and spent 10 minutes watching her move before she went to get the older hand, Walt. Front left, she told him. But it's not the hoof. Watch how she shifts weight. She's overcompensating from the shoulder. Something happened higher up. Walt squinted at her. You a horsewoman? I've spent enough time around lame horses to know what compensating looks like, she said. You should get someone to check the shoulder before you start digging around in her foot. He checked. She was right. A small injury from a fall 2 nights back, nothing serious but enough to cause the irregular gait. The ranch hand who dealt with it looked at Tessa with a measuring expression she couldn't fully read. By the second afternoon, the gathering had developed its own social geography. Margaret Hawes and the women around her occupied one zone of the yard. Sarah Toll's quieter orbit occupied another. Several women had begun drifting toward whichever activity Cade was involved with, creating a trailing, complicated attendance wherever he went. Tessa noticed that he didn't seem to enjoy this. She also noticed that there was a family. The Parkers, who had a homestead half a mile down the road from the Mercer property, who had stopped by the gate twice that day. A woman and 2 children standing at the fence with the specific posture of people who need something but aren't sure they have the right to ask for it. On the second time, Tessa walked over to the gate. You need something, she said. The woman, maybe 30, thin, the look of someone who hadn't slept a full night in a while, looked at Tessa with a mixture of relief and embarrassment. My husband sent me to ask if we could draw from the east side of the well. Our own well's gone completely dry, and the children... She stopped. Hold on, Tessa said. She went to find Walt, because Walt was the one managing the logistics of the gathering, and presumably knew what the arrangement was with the surrounding families. Walt was talking to Cade near the barn. Tessa walked up to them without waiting for a pause in the conversation. There's a family at the gate, she said. The Parkers. Their well is dry and they've got children. Cade looked at her. I know the gathering hasn't been concluded yet, she said. I don't know what the current arrangement is about water access, but their children are thirsty today. A beat. Cade turned to Walt. Open the east well to the Parker family for now. They can draw as they need. Walt nodded and went. Cade looked back at Tessa. You always walk up and interrupt conversations? When it seems like it matters, yes, she said. Something shifted slightly in his face. Not quite a smile, but not nothing either. That evening, a group of women sat around the table after supper, and the conversation turned, as these conversations do in confined spaces, to honesty. It started with Clara Finch crying. She was homesick and frightened, and she had been holding it together for 2 days. And something at dinner had cracked it open, and now she was crying into her handkerchief with a kind of desperate, apologetic crying that suggested she was ashamed of herself for doing it. "It's all right," said Nora Bowen, which was the most direct thing Nora had said to anyone since the gathering began. "I don't even want to be here," Clara said, which made everyone go quiet. "I mean, I do. My family needs... We need the water. We need things to change. But I don't..." She pressed the handkerchief to her face. "I'm 17. I thought maybe this would be... I thought it would feel different, more like a story and less like a business transaction." The silence had a complicated texture to it. "It is a business transaction," Tessa said, not unkindly. "That's what it is. Understanding that doesn't make it worse. It just means you know what you're dealing with." Clara looked at her. "Doesn't that bother you?" Tessa thought about it. "I came here because I need water for my land, and I have no other way to get it," she said. "And because..." She paused, looking for the honest version. "Because I'm tired of waiting for things to work out on their own. Things don't work out on their own. You have to go find what you need." She looked at her hands on the table. "As for the rest of it, I don't know yet. I'll know more when I know more." "You're very practical," Clara said, in a tone that suggested she wasn't sure if this was an admirable quality or a sad one. "Yes," Tessa said. "I am." The third day began with a crisis. One of the other participating women, a woman named Ruth from the south end of the valley, had brought her younger sister along to stay in one of the ranch's outbuildings, and the sister had eaten something bad in the night and was violently ill by morning. Not life-threatening, the kind of illness that looked dramatic and resolved itself in a day, but painful and uncomfortable and requiring more care than a busy ranch could easily spare. Tessa spent the morning with her. She knew what to do for it. Her father had been susceptible to stomach complaints on the road, and she had learned over years what helped and what didn't. She got the girl water with a little salt in it, kept her cool, kept her comfortable, talked to her when she needed distraction, and left her alone when she needed rest. Ruth sat in the doorway and watched Tessa work and said very little. "Why are you doing this?" Ruth said, finally. Tessa wrung out a cloth and folded it. "Because she's sick." "You're wasting a day of the gathering." Tessa looked at her. "Your sister is 16 and she's sick in a strange place. I'm not wasting anything." Ruth looked away. "I should be thanking you instead of... I'm sorry. I'm tired." "I know," Tessa said. She didn't see Kate at all that morning, but Walt found her at noon when she had finally gotten the girls settled and sleeping comfortably, and he said without any particular emphasis, "Mr. Mercer wants to speak with you this afternoon, after the main meal." She almost didn't go. She sat in the bunkhouse after the noon meal and had what she recognized as a very rational moment of losing her nerve. She knew what the gathering had been. She knew what she looked like in it. She had fixed a wagon wheel and spotted a lame horse's real injury and walked up and interrupted a conversation to tell a man that children were thirsty, and she had spent her morning caring for a sick girl instead of finding reasons to stand in Cade Mercer's line of sight. She had not performed anything. She had not tried. She had just done the things that needed doing because the things needed doing. And now he wanted to speak with her. She thought about Dorothy Crane's voice. "I don't understand how she manages." She stood up. She went. Spot. He was at the fence on the western side of the property, the side that looked out over his pasture toward the ridge. When she came up beside him, he didn't turn. They both looked at the land for a moment. 3 days is a strange way to get to know somebody, he said finally. "Yes," she agreed. "Most of what people show you in 3 days is what they want you to see." "Yes." He was quiet. "You didn't do that." Tessa didn't answer immediately. Then, "I didn't see the point. If you chose someone based on 3 days of careful performance, you'd end up with a carefully performing wife. I don't know how to be that." "No," he said. "I could tell." She looked at his profile, the broken nose, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the particular stillness of a man who had spent a long time in open country and absorbed some of its characteristics. I should tell you something, she said. All right. I don't have much. My father's house on the eastern edge of town, which is small and needs work. A plot of land that's barely producing. A water barrel that's almost empty. She paused. I came here because I need water and because my options were limited. I want you to know that's part of why I'm here, because I think you deserve an honest account. He turned and looked at her, direct, unhurried. I know that, he said. Everybody here came because they need something. That's not a reason to discount anyone. He paused. The question I'm asking myself is different. What question is that? He looked back at the ridge. Whether a person, when things go wrong, and things will go wrong, that's just what things do. Whether they'll face it straight or whether they'll fold. Tessa thought about her father's fever, about the 8 days, about the decisions she'd had to make alone, in a small house on the edge of a valley full of people who mostly didn't know her name. I don't fold, she said. It wasn't bravado. It was just true. Cade was quiet for a long time. I know, he said. I've been watching. The pasture grass moved in a dry, hot wind coming off the ridge. Somewhere behind them, in the yard, the gathering's 3 days were winding down toward their end, and women were packing their things and the ranch hands were moving through their afternoon work, and Black Ridge Valley sat in its dry brown summer, waiting. I'd like to ask you something, Cade said, and I'd like a straight answer. Yes, she said. If I ask you to stay, not for the gathering, not for what the gathering is supposed to be about, but to stay and try to build something here. Work this ranch with me. Live on this land. If I ask you that, what do you say? Tessa looked at him. He was looking at her directly, without any calculation in it, without any performance, and she recognized the look because it was the same way she looked at things she needed to assess honestly. She thought about Black Ridge Valley, about Dorothy Crane's voice and the women who laughed and the men who looked through her. She thought about her father's grave on the slope behind the little house and what he would have told her and what she actually believed about herself. She thought about the wagon wheel, the lame mare's shoulder, the Parker children at the gate. Yes, she said. I say yes. He nodded once, the same way Nora Bowen had nodded at her on that first night. The nod of someone who has gotten an answer they consider adequate. All right then, he said. They stood at the fence for a little while longer, both of them looking out at the ridge, while the afternoon settled around them in the dry heat. It was not a fairy tale moment. The land was still dry. The drought was still a fact, and there were 14 other women about to learn something that some of them would take very badly. Tessa's back hurt from 3 days on a bunkhouse mattress, and she was still processing the conversation she'd just had, and Cade Mercer was mostly a stranger to her. But there was something solid in the moment, something with actual weight to it, and she recognized it the way you recognize good material after you've handled enough bad. It felt like the beginning of something that was going to be very hard. She had been through hard before. She went back across the yard toward the bunkhouse, and the afternoon sun lay across Black Ridge Valley like something relentless and patient, and the announcement had not yet been made, and for the next hour or so the world was still ordinary. But not for much longer. When Cade stepped into the center of the yard at 4 in the afternoon and said Tessa Holloway's name, the silence that followed had a specific quality she would never forget. Not the silence of surprise exactly, but of a story that people had already told themselves being torn down in front of them. She was standing at the edge of the yard. She heard her name and she felt the air change. Then she heard Margaret Hawes say, very quietly, to the woman beside her, "You can't be serious." And she heard Clara Finch make a small, involuntary sound that might have been shock or pity or something else entirely. And she heard nothing from most of them, which was louder than any of it. Cade had his eyes on her, waiting. She crossed the yard. Every step felt measured and deliberate, the way steps feel when you know you're being watched. She stopped in front of him. "Well," he said quietly, just for her. "Here we are." "Here we are," she agreed. Behind her, the gathering was already dissolving into the specific noise of 30 opinions forming at once. Voices low, but not low enough. The sounds of indignation and confusion, and something uglier beneath both of them. She did not look back. She looked at Cade Mercer's crooked-nosed, weathered, steady face, and she thought, whatever comes next, it is going to be very difficult, and it is going to require everything you have. She had never been afraid of that. She was not afraid of it now. The noise started before Cade and Tessa had even walked back to the main house. She could hear it building behind her, not shouting, nothing so direct as that, but the particular hum of a crowd that has received information it finds unacceptable and is working through the stages of that. She kept her eyes forward. Cade walked beside her with the same unhurried stride he seemed to use for everything. And if he heard it too, he didn't show it. Walt fell into step on Cade's other side. "You want me to say something to them?" "No," Cade said. "Let them talk." They reached the porch of the main house and Cade held the door. Tessa went in. The door closed behind them and the sound from the yard became muffled but didn't disappear entirely, the way a fire doesn't disappear just because you stop looking at it. The inside of the main house was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. It was clean in a functional way. Not decorated, not neglected, somewhere in between. A long table, a stone hearth with a good iron grate, shelves with actual books on them alongside the usual ledgers and tools. A single window facing west that showed the ridge going gold in the late afternoon light. Cade poured 2 cups of water from a pitcher on the table and set one in front of her. She drank. Her throat was dry from the heat and the tension of the last hour, and she hadn't noticed until the water hit it. "You should know," he said, sitting down across from her, "that this is going to be uncomfortable for a while. I know that. The Valley will have opinions. The Valley has always had opinions about me," she said. "I've been living inside those opinions for 4 years. I know what they feel like." He looked at her with that direct, unhurried attention. "It'll be different now. Before they could feel sorry for you or superior to you. Now they'll feel something worse than either of those things." She understood what he meant. Pity had a comfortable distance to it. What people felt when someone they'd underestimated proved them wrong. That was something raw, something that curdled into resentment because it had nowhere else to go. "I know," she said again, and then, "I can handle it." He nodded, not like he was reassuring her, like he believed her. Outside, the murmur from the yard hadn't settled. Tessa stared at her water cup and thought about the 14 women who had arrived at this ranch 3 days ago, with their hopes packed alongside their good dresses, and she felt something uncomfortable move through her chest. Not guilt, exactly, because she hadn't taken anything from anyone, but something adjacent to it. The awareness of how stories worked, how this one would be told. "What happens now?" she said. "Tonight the other women leave. Walt will arrange transport for anyone who needs it." Cade folded his hands on the table. "After that, there's no schedule. We'll need to talk about arrangements, what this looks like going forward, what the expectations are on both sides. I don't think either of us has any reason to rush." "The water," she said. "You'll open the access to the valley?" I said I would. "I will." He looked at her steadily. "I don't make promises I don't intend to keep." She believed him. That was something she hadn't expected to feel so quickly. A basic sense that the man across from her was telling her the truth. She'd spent enough time around people who weren't to recognize the difference. "All right," she said. "Then tonight I'll stay, and tomorrow we'll talk about what this looks like." "Yes." "And the rest of it?" She paused, not sure how to frame it. "The arrangement between us. That's its own conversation." "It is," he agreed, "and not one we need to have today." She was grateful for that, more than she expected to be. They sat in a silence that was not comfortable, but was at least honest, while the light outside moved from gold toward orange and the sounds from the yard slowly wound themselves down. The gathering was over. Whatever came next was something else entirely. She just didn't know what to call it yet. Margaret Hawes left at dusk. Tessa was at the water trough behind the barn when the wagon carrying Margaret and 2 of the other women rolled past the gate. She wasn't watching for it, just happened to be there. Margaret was sitting straight in the wagon seat with the posture of someone who had decided to be dignified about a situation they found profoundly undignified, and she didn't look toward the barn. But just before the wagon cleared the gate, she said something to the woman beside her, and they both laughed. Sharp, short, the kind of laugh that isn't really a laugh. Tessa turned back to the water trough. The horses needed tending to. That was a fact that existed independent of Margaret Hawes and her opinion of the day's events. Clara Finch found her 20 minutes later. "I wanted to say goodbye," Clara said. She was still carrying her small bag, her transport home presumably arranged. She looked young and tired and like she'd spent some of the afternoon crying, though she'd done her best to hide it. "Safe trip," Tessa said. Clara stood there for a moment, twisting the strap of her bag. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Are you... She stopped, started again. Are you actually happy about this? Or is it just the practical thing and you're... Are you all right? Tessa looked at her. The question was genuine, she could tell. Clara was 17 and she still believed that the difference between what was practical and what made you happy was a problem that needed solving. Tessa hadn't believed that in a while, but she remembered what it felt like to believe it. I don't know yet, she said honestly. It's been 3 days. I don't know him, and he doesn't know me. But I'm not unhappy. She paused. I made a decision with open eyes. That's more than a lot of people get. Clara nodded slowly, working through this. I hope it's good, she said. I really do. Thank you, Clara. After she left, the yard went quiet in the particular way of a place that has been full of people and is suddenly not. The ranch's regular rhythms reasserted themselves. The sound of the hands in the bunkhouse, horses moving in the paddock, the creak of the barn settling in the cooling air. Tessa stood in the middle of it and felt the strange, suspended quality of a life at the moment when it pivots. She had no way of knowing yet what was on the other side. She went in to find somewhere to sleep. News reached town 2 days later. She knew this because she went into town 2 days later, needing to collect her few things from her father's house and make arrangements about what to do with it. And the quality of attention she received on the main street told her everything about what had been said and how it had landed. Dorothy Crane was standing outside the general store with Ellen Marsh, who ran the seamstress shop, when Tessa came up the street. They both saw her. Dorothy's expression went through several adjustments in quick succession. Surprise, then something harder, then the careful neutrality of a woman who had decided to manage this moment rather than react to it. Ellen just stared. Miss Holloway, Dorothy said. Mrs. Crane, Tessa said. Mrs. Marsh. A pause dense enough to step on. We heard about the gathering, Dorothy said, in the tone of a woman who had not only heard but had discussed the gathering at length with multiple people. Quite a surprise for the valley. I imagine so, Tessa said. I hope, Dorothy paused, choosing her words with the careful precision of someone placing a foot on uncertain ice. I hope things go well for you. She didn't sound like she hoped that. She sounded like she was performing the hope from a considerable distance. Thank you, Tessa said, and moved past them. She heard 10 steps later Ellen Marsh say something in a low voice, and Dorothy's answering murmur, and then a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something else. She kept walking. Her face was warm and she was gripping the handle of her bag too tightly, and there was a small, hard knot in her chest that she recognized. She'd been carrying versions of it for 4 years. The house looked smaller than she remembered, which surprised her. She'd been gone less than a week. She stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her father's things, the old trade ledgers on the shelf, the framed map of the eastern route he'd favored, the tin mug he'd used every morning without exception, and she felt the weight of the place settle on her. She was going to have to decide what to do with all of it. She couldn't carry it with her to the Mercer Ranch, not most of it, couldn't leave it here indefinitely either. She sat down at her father's table and put her hands flat on the worn surface and gave herself 5 minutes to feel the full weight of it. The grief that was still there under everything, the uncertainty about the road ahead, the loneliness that had become so habitual she sometimes forgot it was there until something like this brought it back up. 5 minutes. Then she got up and started packing what mattered. The ride back to the Mercer Ranch in the late afternoon was 3 miles of dry road and open sky, and Tessa rode it with her packed bag over the saddle and her father's tin mug in her coat pocket because she'd decided at the last minute she wanted to keep it. She was halfway there when she heard hoofbeats behind her and turned to find Nora Bowen pulling up alongside. Tessa had assumed Nora had gone home after the gathering. "What are you still doing here?" she asked. "Heading home," Nora said. "I took the long way." She settled into pace beside Tessa without asking if that was all right. "How was town?" "About what you'd expect." "Did Dorothy Crane say something to you?" "She said she hoped things went well for me." Nora made a sound that communicated exactly what she thought of that. "I heard Pete Alderman telling his wife that Cade must have lost his mind. And I heard—" She stopped. "Well, it doesn't matter what I heard. Tell me." Nora was quiet for a moment, watching the road ahead. I heard Jim Towell say it's an embarrassment to every decent woman in the valley that Mercer passed over good prospects to pick the Holloway girl. Said it doesn't reflect well on any of them. She paused. He said some other things. I won't repeat them. Tessa looked at the road. The dry, cracked road with its wagon ruts and scattered stones. The same road her father had come into this valley on years ago. Jim Towell has hated my father since before I was born over a disputed trade, she said. He would find fault in anything I did, including breathing. I know, Nora said, but the others, the women especially, they feel slighted, not because you did anything wrong, because you existing in this situation means the story they told themselves about you was wrong. And people hate that more than almost anything. Nora turned and looked at her directly. You're going to have to be better than them, not because you should have to, but because you don't have the option of being equal to them and having it be enough. You know that, right? Yes, Tessa said. I've always known that. Nora nodded. Good. They rode the rest of the way to the ranch turnoff in silence, and when the road split, Nora raised a hand in farewell and took the North Fork without ceremony, and Tessa watched her go and thought that Nora Bowen was probably the most direct person she'd ever met, and that she was glad they'd shared those bunkhouse steps. The ranch was a different place without the gathering's artificial social pressure. It went back to being what it actually was, a working place, governed by the needs of animals and land and weather and the relentless logic of what needed doing. The hands moved through their routines. Walt managed the supply schedule. Cade worked from before dawn until after dark with the matter-of-fact intensity of a man who had never expected anything different from his days. Tessa found her footing in it gradually, the way you find footing on uncertain ground. One careful step, then another, then something that was almost a rhythm. She and Cade had their practical conversation on the third day. It was not romantic, was not meant to be, and she was grateful for that. They sat at the long table after supper and laid out what they each brought, what they each needed, what the arrangement between them would look like in real terms. He was plain about his finances. Better than most in the valley, not wealthy by any measure she'd call extravagant, with the ranch's prosperity tied directly to how well it was managed. She was plain about hers, almost nothing, a plot of land and a small house that she would sell when the time was right to put something toward the ranch. No pretending otherwise. I'll tell you something, she said toward the end of it. I don't need to be managed. I'm not going to be someone who waits to be told what needs doing. If that's a problem, tell me now. He looked at her across the table. Why would that be a problem? Some men prefer it. I've got enough to manage already, he said. I don't need to add people to the list. She almost smiled. They agreed on the shape of things. She would take on the domestic management of the ranch house, which currently had no domestic management to speak of, and needed it, but also take on whatever outside work she was capable of, which was more than he'd maybe expected. A proper arrangement between them, marriage, if they decided that was what it was going to be, would wait until they'd had enough time together to be sure of it. Neither of them was in a hurry for the wrong reasons. One more thing, he said, as they were finishing. Yes. What the town says, I know what they're saying. I know what they'll keep saying. He looked at her steadily. I need you to know that I made this choice for my own reasons, and I stand behind it. If someone in this valley has something to say to me about it, they can say it to me directly. The plain matter-of-factness of it hit her somewhere unexpected. Not because it was a grand declaration. It wasn't. It was just a man saying, I know what I chose, and I'm not apologizing for it. She had not expected to need that as much as she apparently did. Thank you, she said. He gave her the same single nod and started clearing the cups from the table, and that was the end of that conversation, and also in some way the beginning of something she couldn't name yet. The water access opened to the valley that same week. Cade arranged it through Walt, who rode to each of the struggling homesteads and delivered the terms personally. The east well was open for communal drawing, 3 times per week, in organized rotations to prevent overuse. The Mercer supply lines west would carry valley trade goods and bring back what was needed through the dry season. The valley received this gratefully and resentfully in roughly equal measure, as the valley received most things. Pete Alderman came personally to the ranch 3 days after the arrangement was announced, hat in his hands, and told Cade that the smithy was grateful and that he hoped things were going well and that his wife sent her regards. He looked at Tessa once, briefly, and looked away. She was repairing a fence section 30 feet from where they stood. She did not make it easier for him by pretending not to notice. After he left, Walt came over to where she was working. He was quiet for a moment, watching her hammer the post. "You know," he said, "in 20 years working for Mercer's family, I've seen a lot of people come through this place." She said, not pausing. "Cade's father, good man, but he chose his wife for the wrong reasons. Things were hard between them." Walt picked up the spare post and held it steady while she worked. Cade watched that for 20 years, learned something from it. She stopped and looked at him. "I'm not saying anything," Walt said, with the expression of a man who was definitely saying something. "Just giving you information." She went back to the fence. "Thank you, Walt," she said. He grunted and helped her finish the section, and neither of them said anything more about it, and the afternoon light lay across the valley in the particular gold of a summer that had been brutal and was only just now beginning, in some small ways, to give a little. Not enough yet. Not nearly enough. But something. Tessa drove the last nail and tested the post with both hands, and it held. She moved on to the next one. The drought broke in September, but by then the valley had a different problem. It started with the Hargrove homestead going quiet. Dan Hargrove ran 30 head of cattle on the south end of the valley and had been doing it for 11 years without particular incident. He was not a man who missed the communal water rotation, and he was not a man who failed to show up when there was shared work to be done. So when he missed 2 consecutive drawing days and nobody had seen smoke from his chimney in a week, Walt rode out to check on him. He came back with a look on his face that Tessa had not seen before. "Place is empty," Walt told Cade that evening. "Not abandoned. Furniture's there, tools are there, livestock in the pen. But no Dan. No sign of his hand, the young Reyes boy." He paused. "The south fence line has been cut. Clean cuts, not wear. Somebody with wire cutters." Cade was quiet for a moment. "Any tracks?" "Wagon tracks heading west. Heavy load, recent. And something else." Walt set his hat on the table. "There's a notice tacked to his door, printed on good paper, not handwritten. Says the land has been acquired by the Hollister Land and Cattle Company and that all residents must vacate within 30 days or face legal action." The name landed in the room with a particular weight. Tessa looked at Cade. "You know that name." It wasn't a question. Cade turned and looked at her. His jaw was set in a way she had come to recognize over the past weeks. The particular stillness that meant he was controlling something he'd rather not be controlling. "Edgar Hollister," he said. "I know of him. Land speculator out of the Eastern Territories. He's been buying up valley land further north for the past 2 years. Distressed properties, places that had debt, places that had no water rights, places where the owner had died and the inheritance was complicated." He paused. "I didn't think he'd come this far south." "Well," Walt said quietly, "he has." The three of them sat with that for a moment. Outside, the first real clouds in 2 months were moving in off the ridge, piling up in the west in a way that finally, genuinely looked like rain. The drought was ending, and it had apparently brought something with it on its way out. "Who else knows about this?" Tessa asked. "Nobody yet, just me." She looked at Cade. "We need to find out how many other homesteads have gotten that notice." "Yes," he said. "And we need to do it before Hollister's people decide the valley has been softened up enough by the drought to move faster." She thought through it, mapping the valley's geography in her head the way she'd learned to think about terrain, not as scenery, but as a problem of roots and resources. The smaller properties first, the ones that took the hardest hit from the dry season. Cade was watching her with that steady attention she'd noticed during the gathering. "You're already 2 steps ahead." "I'm thinking about what I'd do if I wanted to take this valley," she said simply. "You go after the weakest holdings first. You get enough of them and you control the water access from the south. After that, the middle properties have no choice. They're surrounded." Walt made a low sound. "She's right." Cade stood up. "I'll ride west tomorrow. There are 3 homesteads along the lower creek I haven't had contact with in 2 weeks. "I'll take the eastern side," Tessa said. "The Parkers and the 2 families passed them. They know me well enough by now to talk straight." Cade looked at her for a beat. "Take the gray horse. She's faster than she looks." The Parker homestead confirmed what they'd feared. Ben Parker met her at the gate with the expression of a man who has received bad news and has been sitting with it long enough that the shock has converted itself into a kind of grim, exhausted resignation. His wife stood on the porch behind him, with their youngest on her hip, watching. "You got one of those notices," Tessa said, 3 days ago. Ben pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket and held it out. She took it and read it. Same language as the one at Hargrove's. Same company name. "They came in person the day before. 2 men I've never seen. Very polite, very well dressed for men in the middle of nowhere. Said the company had acquired the water rights to the lower eastern creek and that any homestead dependent on that creek for irrigation would need to come to a new arrangement with Hollister's company or face—" He stopped. "They used legal language, but the meaning was plain enough. Did they threaten you directly?" "Not directly." His mouth was tight. "The bigger one said he hoped we'd be reasonable, and he looked at my wife when he said it. That's the kind of threat where they can say afterward, they didn't threaten anyone." Tessa folded the paper and handed it back. "How many families along the eastern creek do you know of who have gotten this?" "At least 4, maybe more. The Wheelers are talking about selling. They've got young children and no reserves left after the drought, and they're scared." He looked at her. "What's Mercer going to do?" "We're going to figure that out," she said. "But I need you to do something first. Can you get word to every homestead on the eastern side to come to the Mercer Ranch 3 days from now? Evening. Don't use the main road. If Hollister has people watching the valley, I don't want them seeing a gathering." Ben stared at her. "You've got a plan?" "I've got the beginning of one," she said honestly. "That's more than nothing." The 2 families past the Parkers told the same story, with variations. One had already signed a preliminary agreement with the Hollister Company's representative under the impression that it was a water use arrangement rather than a land transfer, a distinction the fine print apparently rendered meaningless. The wife of that family, a woman named Iris Delacroix, who had come west from Louisiana 12 years ago and built her homestead piece by piece with her husband, sat across from Tessa at her kitchen table with the paper in her hands and read it again and said, very quietly, "They made it sound like we were protecting ourselves." "I know," Tessa said. "My husband signed it. He was trying to take care of us." Iris set the paper down carefully, like something dangerous. "If that paper means what you say it means, I think it can be contested," Tessa said, "if it was signed under a misrepresentation. But that's not something I can promise. I'm not a lawyer." "Do you know a lawyer?" Tessa thought about Cade, about his trade connections west. "Possibly," she said. "Give me a week." She rode back to the Mercer Ranch in the late afternoon, with the early clouds of September finally delivering on their promise, a thin, tentative rain beginning to fall on the dry land. And she thought about Edgar Hollister and his well-dressed representatives, and the specific methodology of a man who let drought and fear do his work for him before he came in with papers and polite smiles. She thought about her father's trading years. The men who had done the same thing with different tools, waited for desperate people, and then arrived with solutions that cost more than they appeared to. She had watched her father refuse those deals more than once, even when the alternative was harder. She knew the shape of them. Cade's ride west had found 2 more affected homesteads, one of which had already been fully vacated. The family gone, the property sitting empty with a Hollister Company stake driven into the ground at the gate. The other, the Vance family, had refused to sign anything and had subsequently found their access road blocked by a fallen tree that had been too neatly placed to be accidental. They laid all of it out on the table that night. Tessa, Cade, Walt, and Ben Parker, who Cade had asked to come. "How many properties total?" Cade said. 6 that we know of, confirmed, Tessa said. "Probably more. The notices seem to have gone out over a period of weeks. He's been systematic about it." "Hollister's approach is to create enough pressure that people sign individually," Cade said. "Each family thinking they're the only one dealing with it, or that they're the last holdout and there's no point resisting." He looked around the table. "The moment people realize they're not alone, the strategy falls apart." "Which is why we need that meeting," Tessa said. Ben Parker was looking at her with an expression she was learning to identify. It was the expression people got when they were recalibrating something. "You said you had the beginning of a plan," he said. "I do." She had spent the ride home working through the geography, the routes, the resources. Hollister's power over this valley comes from two things: the legal papers he's getting people to sign, and the supply routes. He's been buying up the Western Trail access. That's how he cut off the Vance family. If he controls the road west, he controls the valley's connection to trade and resupply. She paused. But the Western Road isn't the only route. Walt looked up. There are mountain passes to the north, she said. I rode up toward them twice in August when I was looking at the ranch's back pasture boundaries. They're rough, not wagon-friendly in their current state, but they connect to the upper trade roads. If we improve 2 or 3 sections, put in proper footing on the worst stretches, we'd have a supply route that Hollister can't touch because he doesn't own that land. It's common territory, too high for grazing. Nobody's claimed it. Silence around the table. That's a significant amount of work, Cade said carefully. Yes, it is. She looked at him. But we have something Hollister doesn't. We have people who need this to work and who can put in the labor if they know it's going somewhere. She turned to Ben. The families who haven't signed yet, they're scared because they feel isolated. Give them something to do together. Give them a concrete problem they can solve with their own hands. Fear sits still. Work moves. Ben was nodding slowly. The other thing, Tessa continued, is the Delacroix paper. The agreement Iris's husband signed under false pretenses. If that can be challenged legally, it breaks Hollister's chain of title on the Eastern Creek. He can't claim water rights he doesn't legitimately own. Cade said, I know a man in Carlisle, Frank Deeds. He's handled land disputes before. I can get a letter to him in 4 days. Do it, Tessa said. Then she stopped herself. If you agree, Cade looked at her with something almost like amusement. You don't need to ask my permission for cents, he said. The meeting broke up late. Ben Parker shook Cade's hand at the door and then, with a visible effort, turned to Tessa and shook hers too. It was a small gesture and he was slightly awkward about it, but he did it, and that mattered. After he left, Walt started putting out the lamps. Cade stood at the window looking at the rain, which had grown heavier. The pass route, he said without turning around. Have you walked it? Partially. It'll be dangerous in bad weather. Yes, she said. It will. He was quiet for a moment. I'll go up with you next week. Before we bring other people into it, I want to see what we're asking them to work on. She had been prepared to argue for this. She'd had the argument organized in her head. The fact that it wasn't needed left a brief, small gap. All right, she said. Tessa? She turned. He was still looking at the rain. What you laid out tonight, most people would have sat on that until they were more comfortable, more certain. You didn't. There isn't time to be comfortable, she said. No, he agreed. There isn't. He turned from the window and looked at her directly. I just want you to know I'm not going to be one of those people who stands aside while you carry the weight of something and then claims credit for it afterward. She held his gaze. I know that. Good. The rain came down on the dry valley, and the land absorbed it with the indifference of something that has been waiting a long time, and Tessa went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and felt the full size of what they were walking into. The valley meeting happened on a Tuesday evening. 12 families crowded into the Mercer barn with the rain still coming down on the roof. Tessa stood at the front of it beside Cade, which was not something she had planned but had somehow happened naturally. She'd been explaining the map pinned to the barn wall when people started arriving, and she'd simply stayed where she was. The room was tense in the particular way of frightened people who haven't yet decided whether to be frightened together or separately. Jim Towell was there. She had not expected that. He stood at the back of the barn with his arms crossed, and she could feel his presence the way you can feel a specific kind of weather. She laid out everything she knew: the extent of Hollister's operation, the number of affected properties, the fraudulent framing of the Delacroix agreement. She spoke plainly, without drama, because drama was what frightened people didn't need. They needed clarity. The mountain route, she said, pointing to the map. These 2 sections are the problem ones. If we get 20 people on them for 2 weekends, they're passable for supply wagons. After that, we have a trade route that Hollister cannot block, cut off, or buy. A man named George Webb, who had farmed the western middle section for 8 years, raised his hand. And what about the notices we've already received? What about the legal threat? A lawyer in Carlisle is reviewing the Delacroix agreement as of this week. Cade said. If it was obtained through misrepresentation, which we believe it was, the water rights claim falls apart. Without legitimate water rights on the Eastern Creek, Hollister has no legal basis for half his notices. And if the lawyer disagrees, Webb pressed, then we look at other options, Tessa said. But we do that together, not one family at a time, alone, in a kitchen with a polite man in a good suit telling you that you have no choice. The room absorbed this. Jim Towell spoke from the back. Who put her in charge? It landed in the room like a stone in water. Tessa kept her eyes on the rest of the crowd. She could feel it, the shift, people waiting to see how this would go. Nobody put me in charge, she said evenly. I'm sharing information and a plan. You can use it or not. That's up to you. She paused. But I'd ask you what your alternative is, Jim, because if you've got a better one, I'd very genuinely like to hear it. Towell's jaw was set. Nobody else spoke. After a moment, Ben Parker said from the left side of the barn, I'm in for the mountain work, 2 weekends, however many days it takes. 3 other voices followed immediately. Then 2 more. Then gradually, the room shifted its weight. Toll left before it was over. He pushed through the barn door without speaking, out into the rain, and Tessa watched him go and filed the information away without comment. By the end of the evening, 14 of the 12 families had committed to the pass work. 2 had held back, one elderly couple who couldn't contribute labor and knew it, and one family that Tessa suspected was still weighing their options with the Hollister Company. She didn't push. Cade waited until the barn had emptied before he spoke. Towell's going to be a problem. Yes, she said. He has connections in town. If he talks to the right people, I know. She was folding the map. We'll deal with that when it becomes something to deal with. Right now, the pass is the priority. She put the map in her coat and walked out into the rain, and it was cold, and the mud was already thick underfoot, and the mountain route they'd planned was going to be brutal in this weather. And somewhere in the valley, Edgar Hollister's representatives were in warm lodgings reading their documentation and feeling confident about the arithmetic of other people's desperation. She thought, not yet you don't. She went back inside. The first weekend on the mountain pass nearly broke them before they'd done anything useful. 18 people showed up at the northern trailhead on a Saturday morning in late September, which was more than Tessa had expected and less prepared than she'd hoped. They came with the right intentions and the wrong tools. Axes that needed sharpening, ropes that were too short, 2 wagons that had no business on an incline and would need to wait at the base. The weather was cold and the sky had the flat gray look of something that hadn't decided yet whether to rain. Tessa had been up at the pass twice in the previous week with Cade, walking the problem sections, marking the worst stretches with stones, figuring out where the rock face needed breaking and where the existing surface just needed clearing and compacting. She had a sequence in her head. She kept it there and translated it into instructions as they went, because the moment you showed people a full map of how hard something was going to be, half of them found reasons to leave. The first problem section was a 20-foot stretch, where the trail dropped sharply to the left and the right edge had eroded down to loose shale. Cade worked the left side with 2 of the stronger men, cutting into the hill face to widen the trail. Ben Parker managed the shale removal on the right. Tessa directed the middle ground. The leveling, the packing, the placement of the flat stones they'd hauled up in packs to provide stable footing. By noon, they had covered 8 feet. George Webb sat down on a rock and looked at the 8 feet of improved trail, and then at the remaining 12, and then at the 2 further problem sections ahead and said, with the tone of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't like, this is going to take a lot more than 2 weekends. Yes, Tessa said. It is. You knew that. I suspected it. He looked at her. Then why'd you say 2 weekends at the meeting? Because if I'd said 6 4 families wouldn't have come at all. She handed him a water canteen. Now you're here. Now you can see what it is. And now I'm asking you honestly, how long are you willing to work on this? Webb drank the water and looked at the trail and looked at the mountains and exhaled through his nose. As long as it takes, I suppose, he said. Not happily, but honestly. That's all I wanted to know, she said. They worked until the light gave out. Except Frank Deeds, the lawyer from Carlisle, sent his response in the second week of October. Cade read it at the table and then passed it to Tessa without comment. Deeds had reviewed the Delacroix Agreement and the water rights documentation Hollister's company had used to construct it. His conclusion was careful, lawyerly, hedged with appropriate uncertainty, but its core finding was clear. The water rights Hollister claimed on the Eastern Creek had been recorded through a title transfer from a previous owner who had, themselves, acquired the rights under disputed circumstances 15 years prior. The chain of title had a flaw in it. Not a guaranteed case winner, Deeds noted, but enough to challenge, and more importantly, enough to make the challenge expensive and time-consuming for Hollister's company. He's not going to want a long legal fight, Cade said. Men like Hollister move fast because speed is how they win. The moment you slow them down and make the cost uncertain, they look for easier ground. Unless he's already too far committed to this valley to back off, Tessa said. Then we make it cost him more to stay than to leave. She set the letter down. We need to get this to Iris Delacroix before Hollister's people come back for a follow-up conversation. I'll write out today. And we need the other families who've gotten notices to know about the title flaw. Publicly, not just privately. She paused, thinking. If Hollister's representatives know that the valley knows about the problem in his chain of title, it changes the calculus. They've been operating on the assumption that each family is isolated and uninformed. We need to make it clear that assumption is wrong. Cade was quiet for a moment. You want to go to the town meeting. Black Ridge Valley held a monthly gathering at the saloon. Not a formal civic institution, more a habit that had calcified over years into something close to one. It was the following Thursday. Yes, she said, Towel will be there. I know. He's been talking, Cade said carefully. I've heard some of what he's been saying about the plan. About you. He paused. About me, for choosing you. Tessa looked at him directly. What has he been saying about you? A beat. That I've let a woman lead me into a fight that isn't mine and won't end well for the valley. He said it flatly, not with anger but with the precision of someone reporting something they've processed and set aside. That the whole mountain route plan is foolish and that the smart move is to negotiate with Hollister rather than antagonize him. He might be making that argument because he believes it, she said, or he might be making it because someone made it worth his while to make it. Cade looked at her. I'm not accusing him, she said. I'm saying it's worth knowing which one it is before Thursday. It was Walt who found out, and the way Walt found things out, by being present in places without calling attention to himself, and by listening with the patience of a man who had never found silence uncomfortable. He came to Tessa on a Wednesday evening and told her without preamble, Hollister's company made contact with Toll 6 weeks ago, before the Valley meeting in the barn. They offered him a buyout for his property at 3 times its current value on the condition that he discourage organized resistance in the Valley. Tessa sat with this for a moment. Does Cade know? Not yet. I came to you first because... Walt stopped. Because? He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. Because I wanted to see what you'd do with it. She understood. He was still assessing her, in the quiet, ongoing way he'd been assessing her since she'd arrived. She didn't resent it. It was reasonable. I'm going to tell Cade tonight, she said. And at the Thursday meeting, I'm going to lay out what Hollister has been doing, including his approach to Tal, without making it personal. The information is what matters, not the condemnation. Walt nodded. And Walt? She met his eyes. You've been paying attention to this valley a long time. Is there anything else I need to know before Thursday? He considered. The Wheeler family. You thought they were still weighing their options with Hollister. They've decided. They signed last week. He paused. But they signed because they're scared, not because they want to. If you can show them the title flaw and the mountain route is real and passable, they might be willing to contest the agreement. Where are they with Hollister's people right now? They've had no follow-up contact since signing. The company wanted the signature, not the family, so they'll move to force the property claim sometime in the next few months. Then there's still time. Some, Walt said. Not much. She went to find Cade. The Thursday meeting at the saloon was standing room. More people had come than usually bothered, which told Tessa that word had spread about the Hollister situation even beyond the families directly affected. People who had no notices on their doors were there because they understood, correctly, that what happened to the southern and eastern homesteads would eventually reach them if it wasn't stopped. Tal was at the bar. He watched her come in with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not quite hostile, not quite guilty. Something complicated. Cade stood beside her at the front of the room, which mattered. He wasn't speaking for her or ahead of her. He was simply there, visibly there, in a way that said to the room, "This is not a woman acting alone." She laid out the full picture. The systematic nature of Hollister's approach, working drought-weakened families one at a time. The fraudulent framing of the Delacroix agreement and the lawyer's finding on the title flaw. The blocked road to the Vance property. The Hargrove homestead standing empty. The contact with at least one Valley resident that had been aimed at discouraging organized response. She said this plainly, without looking at Tal, without naming him. The room was very quiet. "The mountain route is 3 weekends from passable," she said. "The supply wagons we ran up there last weekend made the middle section. We have the northern problem section left and the eastern descent." She paused. "After that, this valley has a trade route that no land company can block, cut off, or leverage. That changes what Hollister's operation is worth to him." Pete Alderman spoke up. "And the legal challenge to the water rights? Frank Deeds in Carlisle is prepared to file on behalf of the affected families. The cost is shared across 12 homesteads. It comes to less than 2 weeks of trade for most." She looked around the room. "But it only works if the families hold. The moment someone signs independently, the chain breaks." George Webb said, from the middle of the room, "The Wheelers signed." The room shifted. Tessa said, "I know. And I'd ask everyone here to understand that the Wheelers signed because they were frightened and felt alone, and that a signed paper obtained through misrepresentation can be contested. They are not the enemy here. The situation they were put in is the problem." She let that sit for a moment. "I've spoken with them. They're willing to contest if they're not standing alone." A silence. Then Jim Towle set down his glass and said, in a voice that carried across the room, "You've been doing a lot of speaking with a lot of people for a woman who showed up here 3 months ago with nothing." The room went very still. Tessa turned and looked at him. She had thought about this moment, had known it was coming in some form. She had run through several versions of what she might say. What she said was, "You're right, I did come here with nothing, and I've been working with what this valley has, same as everyone else in this room." She kept her voice level. "I'm not asking anyone to trust me personally. I'm asking them to look at the information in front of them and make their own decision." Tal held her gaze. His jaw was tight. Around him the room was watching. "I'm also going to say something else," she continued. "Hollister's people approached several members of this valley before our barn meeting. They offered certain people incentives to discourage organized resistance. I'm not going to name names because I don't think naming names helps us right now." Bishtab. She paused. "What I'm saying is that some people have been put in a difficult position, and if any of those people want to step back from that position and work with the valley instead, the door is open. No penalty, no public condemnation. We need people, not enemies." The room was absolutely silent. She watched Towle's face, watched the complicated thing moving through it, the defensiveness, the anger, and underneath both of those, something that might have been, just barely, relief at a door left open. He said nothing, but he didn't push back either. Cade spoke for the first time. "The Valley meeting 4 weeks from now, I'd like a full account of where the root work stands and where the legal challenge stands. Anyone who wants to contribute to either, speak to me or Tessa before the end of the evening." 9 people did. The enforcers came on a Friday morning in November, when the first real cold had settled into the valley and the mountain route was 5 days from finished. 4 men on horseback, well armed, with a company representative in a wagon behind them, the same type Iris Delacroix had described, well-dressed and polite, with something hard underneath. They came to the Vance property first, which was the one they'd already blocked off, with papers that claimed the company was taking formal possession. Thomas Vance sent his son to the Mercer Ranch at a dead gallop. Tessa was already on horseback by the time the boy finished his first sentence. What happened that morning was not a confrontation in the way of stories. Nobody drew a weapon, nobody threw a punch, nothing exploded. The reality of it was slower and colder, and in some ways more tense for that, because the threat was legal and the response had to be too. Kate arrived at the Vance property with Tessa and Walt and Ben Parker, just as the company representative was presenting his documents to a pale but steady Thomas Vance. 5 other Valley families arrived within the hour. Someone had ridden for Pete Alderman, who came with a copy of Frank Deed's letter regarding the title flaw. The company representative went on. His name was Colton, he said, with the careful pleasantness of a man trained for difficult conversations. Looked at the gathering crowd and then at the Deed's letter and then back at the crowd. These are legitimate property documents, he said. This is a legitimate legal finding regarding the chain of title on the water rights those documents depend on, Tessa said. She was standing in front of him with the Deed's letter in her hand. Filed with the county recorder in Carlisle 3 days ago. The challenge is on the public record. She paused. Mr. Colton, you can execute what your company is asking you to execute today. And then you and your company can spend the next 2 or 3 years in a legal dispute over whether you had the right to, while this valley and its families operate through the mountain trade route that will be fully open within the week. She held his gaze. Or you can take that information back to Mr. Hollister and let him decide whether this valley is worth what it's going to cost him. Colton looked at the families around him. He looked at the Deed's letter. He looked at Cade, who was standing slightly behind Tessa and to her left, and who was watching Colton with the particular stillness of a man who was not going to be the first to move, but was absolutely prepared to be the second. I'll need to consult with my principal, Colton said. Yes, Tessa said. You will. He left before noon. The 4 armed men went with him. Thomas Vance stood in front of his own gate and watched them go, and then turned to look at Tessa. He was 52 years old, had built his property with 12 years of hard work, and in this moment he looked like a man who has just been reminded that the thing he built is still his. He said, "Thank you," and it came out with a roughness that had nothing to do with the cold. "We held the line together," she said. "All of us." He nodded. He pressed his lips together. He went back inside. Ben Parker came to stand beside Tessa, and they both looked at the empty road where the wagon had been. "You think Hollister will push back?" Ben said. "I think Hollister is a businessman," she said, "and businessmen move to easier ground when the current ground gets expensive." She paused. "But we don't stop working on the route until it's done, and we don't stop the legal challenge until the title question is settled. Not yet." "No," Ben agreed. "Not yet." The cold wind came off the ridge and carried the smell of early snow from the high places, and the valley sat quiet around them, and Tessa stood in the middle of it and felt something that wasn't triumph. It was too early for that, and she was too practical to call it that yet, but was something adjacent, something like the feeling of a fence post that has been driven in true and tested with both hands and held. Not done, but holding. Hollister's company did not come back the following week. They didn't come back the week after that either. Colton's wagon disappeared down the valley road, and the 4 armed men went with it. And the silence that followed had a different quality than the silence before. Less like a held breath, more like ground that had been tested and found solid underfoot. The valley didn't celebrate. These were people who had lived long enough in hard country to know that the absence of a threat was not the same as the end of one, and they kept working on the mountain route, and they kept the legal challenge moving through Frank Deed's in Carlisle, and they kept their eyes on the road west. The route was finished on the 2nd Saturday of November. Tessa was there when the first supply wagon came through the northern descent, a heavy protesting vehicle driven by Ben Parker with his oldest son riding alongside, both of them looking like men who had expected to tip over 3 times and were quietly astonished to still be upright. The trail was rough. It would need maintenance, especially through the winter, and the eastern descent required a careful hand on the brake and a horse that trusted its driver. But it was passable. Fully, genuinely passable. George Webb, who had sat on a rock in September and done the arithmetic on how long this would take, stood at the bottom of the descent and watched Ben's wagon come through and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, to nobody in particular, "Well, I'll be damned." There was no ceremony. The wagon came down, they unloaded what needed unloading, and they started talking about what the next supply run would carry and when. That was the celebration. The practical conversation about what came next. It was, Tessa thought, exactly the right kind. Cade stood beside her while the wagon was being unloaded. He'd been up on the route for 2 of the 5 working weekends, handling the hardest sections of rock breaking on the northern problem stretch. His hands were still showing the evidence of it, scraped knuckles, a deep bruise along his left palm from a misdirected sledgehammer swing that he'd mentioned once and not again. "You should have Iris look at that hand," Tessa said. "It's fine. It's been 3 weeks and it's still purple. It's a bruise, not a wound." She looked at him. "Cade?" He glanced at her sideways. "I'll have Iris look at it." "Thank you." He almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile she'd been cataloging over the months. The slight ease around his eyes, the barely perceptible shift at the corner of his mouth. She'd come to understand that this was, for him, the equivalent of what other men did with their whole face. Frank Deed's formal filing on the Delacroix water rights reached the county recorder in late November. What it did practically was place a legal cloud over every property claim Hollister's company had made in Black Ridge Valley that depended on Eastern Creek access, which was most of them. It didn't resolve the dispute in a day or a month, because nothing legal did, but it accomplished what Tessa had told Cade it would. It made the valley expensive. Not impossible, not untouchable, just expensive enough and slow enough that a businessman who moved fast for a living had to sit down and recalculate. The letter from Hollister's company came in December. It was addressed to Cade as the valley's most substantial property owner, which irritated Tessa for reasons she acknowledged were partly personal and partly practical. She had been the one dealing with this for 3 months, and the company still defaulted to writing to the man. But she read the letter with Cade at the kitchen table and focused on what it said rather than how it was addressed. What it said, in the careful language of lawyers communicating on behalf of people who did not want to leave written evidence of their intentions, was that the company was reviewing its operations in the Black Ridge Valley region and was open to discussions regarding the resolution of current property disputes. Cade set the letter down. "He wants out. He wants out cleanly," she said. "He wants the legal challenge to go away, and he wants the affected families to not pursue further action, and he wants it all to look like a misunderstanding rather than a scheme." Are we going to give him that? Tessa thought about it honestly. About Iris Delacroix's face at the kitchen table, reading the paper she'd been deceived into signing. About the Hargrove homestead standing empty. About Thomas Vance watching armed men ride away from his gate. About the Wheeler family who had signed out of fear and spent 2 months sick with the anxiety of it. "We're going to give him the resolution," she said, "not the clean story. Anyone who wants to pursue individual claims against his company for the misrepresentations should have the right to do that. What we give him is the agreement to stop the pressure, restore the properties, honor the contested claims. What we don't give him is the pretense that nothing happened. He may not accept those terms. Then the legal challenge continues and costs him more." She looked at Cade directly. "But I think he accepts them. Men like Hollister don't actually enjoy fights. They enjoy winning before the fight starts. The moment it becomes a real fight, they look for the exit." She was right. It took 6 weeks of back and forth through lawyers, but Hollister's company ultimately agreed. The Hargrove property was released. Dan Hargrove came back in January, thin and shaken and deeply grateful, and spent 2 days just walking his own land before he said much to anyone. The Wheeler agreement was voided. The Delacroix Water Rights Challenge was settled in the valley's favor in February, a county ruling that took the Eastern Creek out of Hollister's claimed holdings permanently. The company's operation in Black Ridge Valley closed. Colton and his well-dressed colleagues did not return. The valley let out a breath it had been holding since September. Winter was hard in the way that winters on the frontier were always hard, relentless and indifferent, testing everything that wasn't built properly and a few things that were. The mountain route required maintenance after the first heavy snow, and 3 families worked 3 Saturdays in January to keep it open for the supply wagons. The work was cold and miserable and necessary, and people did it, which told Tessa something important about what the valley had become through the previous months. A place that had spent years in its separate, isolated pieces had discovered through a shared threat that it was more capable together than it had believed. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, the thing that mattered most. She and Cade married in February, which was not when either of them had expected to do it, and which happened in the way that practical decisions between practical people sometimes happen. Not through a dramatic declaration, but through a conversation at the kitchen table one evening where they both arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously and said so. "I think we should make this official," Cade said. "Yes," she said. "I think so too." There was no ceremony at first. They rode to the county seat with Walt as witness and signed the papers and rode back. And that was that. Walt made a point of shaking both their hands at the door when they got home, with a formality that was entirely his own, and then went to bed. Tessa stood in the kitchen of what was now, legally, her home too, and looked around at the shelves and the hearth and the long table and felt the weight of the moment settle over her. Not perfectly. Nothing settled perfectly. There were things she and Cade hadn't resolved yet. Habits that created friction, differences in how they approached decisions, the particular tension that came from two people who had each spent years being entirely self-reliant, now learning to factor another person into their thinking. Some mornings were difficult. Some conversations went wrong and had to be repaired. They were not a story. They were people, which was harder and more durable than a story, and they both understood that. But there was something real in it, something she had not expected to find and was still learning to trust. The Valley Gathering that spring was Ben Parker's idea, and he came to Tessa in March with his hat in his hands and a slightly awkward expression that she had come to recognize as his version of vulnerability. "The Valley wants to do something," he said, "to mark... I don't know how to say this without it sounding like a speech, which I'm bad at." "Say it plainly," she said. "People want to say thank you, not just to you, to everyone who worked on the route, to Cade, to Walt, to the families who held the line, but also..." He stopped, started again. "Mostly to you, Tessa, because everyone knows what the plan was and who made it." She was quiet for a moment. "Ben, I know you don't need it," he said, with a directness that surprised her. "That's not why we want to do it. We want to do it because it's true, and because a lot of people in this valley said things and thought things about you that they owe you something for. Not everyone is going to say sorry out loud, but they can show up." He paused. "Let us show up." She looked at him, his plain, tired, honest face. This man who had stood at the water rotation gate and shaken her hand with visible effort back in August, who had sent his son galloping to the Mercer Ranch when the enforcers came, who had driven the first supply wagon down the mountain route. "All right," she said. The gathering was held on the first Saturday of April, when the valley had finally, convincingly turned the corner into spring. It happened in the open ground behind the Mercer barn. Not formal, not decorated, not the kind of occasion where people wore their good clothes and made speeches. People brought food and set it out on tables, and there was a fire, and there was noise and children running, and it had the quality of something real rather than arranged. Dorothy Crane was there. Tessa noticed her early in the evening, standing near the edge of the gathering with her husband, holding a plate of food and wearing the careful expression of a woman who has decided to be somewhere she finds uncomfortable and has committed to seeing it through. When their eyes met, Dorothy held the contact for a moment and then nodded, a single, deliberate nod. Not an apology, not even close, but an acknowledgement. Recognition of something she hadn't previously been willing to see. Tessa nodded back. Ellen Marsh came to find her later in the evening, while Tessa was helping reorganize the food table, and stood beside her in the slightly tortured way of someone who has been rehearsing something. "I owe you an apology," Ellen said. "You don't have to..." "Yes, I do. Let me." Ellen pressed her lips together. "I said things. Not just once. I was unkind, and I was wrong, and you've had to know that all along while I didn't." She exhaled. "I'm sorry, Tessa." Tessa looked at her. Ellen was genuinely uncomfortable, genuinely ashamed, and genuine discomfort was worth more than polished remorse. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate you saying it. It wasn't a hug. It wasn't a friendship. Not yet. Maybe never. But it was something. Jim Towle did not come to the gathering. She hadn't expected him to, and she didn't spend time on his absence. There were people in every situation who couldn't find their way back from the position they'd taken, and that was their business, not hers. She had enough to attend to without carrying the weight of people who didn't want to be helped. Cade found her later in the evening, standing apart from the main fire, looking out toward the ridge. The mountains were still snow-capped, but the valley below them was green, properly green for the first time in almost a year. The creek was running again. The pastures had come back. "How are you doing?" he asked. It was a question he'd gotten better at asking. She'd noticed that, The gradual, effortful change in a man who had lived alone long enough that checking on someone else's state didn't come naturally. "I'm all right," she said, and then, because she was honest with him in ways she hadn't been honest with people in a long time. "It's strange, being on this side of it." "This side of what?" "Being the person people are glad to know." She kept her eyes on the ridge. "I spent 4 years in this valley being background, at best, something people looked through or looked past. And now they're here, eating food at a table behind my house, and some of them are people who would have laughed at me last year." She paused. "It's not a bad feeling. It's just strange. I don't know what to do with it yet." Cade was quiet for a moment. He had a quality she had come to value enormously: the ability to be quiet with something, rather than rushing to fill it. "You don't have to do anything with it," he said finally. "It's just true. You can let it be true without figuring out what it means." She looked at him. "You sound like a philosopher," she said. "Walt told me that once. I thought it was idiotic at the time." He paused. "I've come around." She laughed. It came out sudden and genuine and slightly surprised her, and she heard him make a sound beside her that was as close to a laugh as he usually got. And for a moment they stood in the cooling spring evening with the sound of the gathering behind them and the mountains ahead of them, and it was not perfect. She was tired in a way that went to the bone. Her hands were rough from months of outdoor work. They had a difficult conversation ahead of them about the east pasture boundary that had been simmering for a week. There were still families in the valley who were rebuilding after the drought and the Hollister trouble, and the mountain route needed spring maintenance before the summer trade season, and the world had its endless supply of things that needed doing. None of that was going away. But this moment was also real. The laughter, the mountain lion, the man beside her who had looked at her across a yard 8 months ago and said her name in front of everyone and meant it. She thought about her father, about his trader's optimism that had driven her crazy sometimes, his belief that the difficult season was just the edge before the easy one. He had been wrong about that more often than not, but he had been right that you had to go toward the thing rather than wait for it to come to you. That whatever you needed, you had to go find it with your eyes open. She had done that. She had packed a bag and walked 3 miles and fixed a wagon wheel and spoken plainly to a man who turned out to be worth speaking plainly to. She had stood in front of a valley that didn't want her there and laid out a plan and asked for nothing except that people look at the facts in front of them and make their own decision. It had not been graceful. She had been frightened at various points and stubborn at others, and wrong about a few things she'd been certain of. She had driven fence posts and hauled rocks and sat in a cold barn while families who'd once mocked her decided whether to trust her, and most of them had eventually decided yes. That was not a fairy tale. It was not a story with clean edges and a tidy ending. There was still a grave on the slope behind a small house on the eastern edge of town, and she still visited it, and the grief was still there when she did. There were still people in Black Ridge Valley who would look at her and see the woman they had decided she was before she had any say in the matter, and some of them would never change that. But the valley was here. The creek was running. The route through the mountains was open, and the supply wagons used it twice a month. Families who had been alone in their fear were not alone anymore. The land that had been on the edge of being picked apart piece by a careful predator was still whole. She had not done that by herself, but she had started it, and she had held the line when it needed holding, and she had trusted that practical problem-solving done with honesty and without flinching was worth more than any amount of waiting for someone else to fix things. The fire behind them crackled. Ben Parker was telling a story that was making people laugh. Walt was sitting on a fence rail at the edge of the firelight with a tin cup, watching the gathering with the expression of a man who had seen a great deal and was quietly satisfied with this particular piece of it. Cade's hand found hers in the dark. She held it. The mountains stood where they had always stood, indifferent and enormous, and the valley lay in the spring dark at their feet. And Tessa Mercer now, though she still caught herself forgetting it, stood at the edge of the firelight and looked at everything that had been built out of a drought and a threat and a gathering that everyone had expected to go a different way. Not perfect, not finished, not a story where the hard things stopped happening, just real, just hers, just worth it. That was enough. More than enough. It was in the end, everything.